As much as anything, sometimes co-management isn't a process, it's an attitude. And more seeing people really believe in it, and the merits in doing business in a different way.
Welcome to another episode of the Co-Management Commons Show. I really enjoyed this conversation because it was with great guests on the opposite coast from my homelands in Labrador. Guests Tawney and Tim Hawkins are based in Port Alberni on Vancouver Island, and the organization they work for has a unique backstory. They are doing so much diverse work that there is a lot to learn from them. And I really took away how much diversity there is in co-management in British Columbia. And Tawney and Tim really highlight how co-management can be done well with or without land claim agreements. And many First Nations are choosing how they want to go about formulating their future with co-management. And finally, I really loved how Tawney frames co-management as an attitude. I think you'll enjoy this part of the show. And with that, I hope you enjoy and take the time to learn all about their great work on the West Coast. Take care. Welcome, Tim and Tawney, to the Co-Management Commons Show. Really grateful that you are taking time out of your busy schedules on the West Coast. I know it's early morning for you and snowing for me over here in Labrador, but really grateful. And I was really happy to learn about your organization recently through a student that I had been teaching at Dalhousie. And that's kind of what led me to your organization and got super interested in learning more about your work and all of the facilitation you do, and how a lot of it is not necessarily with organizations that have treaties, and that's something different from the work that I do. But maybe we could just introduce yourselves to the listeners and share a bit about your positionality and how you got into this work. Maybe we could start with you, Tawney.
Good morning, Jamie. We certainly appreciate the invite to speak with you this morning. My name's Tawney Lem. Live here in Hoopachesset and Sechot territory in what's now known as Port Alberni. And I'm the executive director with West Coast Aquatic. I've been here for coming up 10 years. And in terms of what brought me into this, it's a bit of a story, but the abbreviated version was I moved to Port Alberni in 1996 for 2 years, and I'm still here. And sometimes I have a bit of envy when I hear about people who were young and they knew exactly what they wanted to be and they had this straight path forward. That wasn't the case for me. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of the work that we do now, and even in the past, when I was in university, those weren't even a thing yet. But moved out here to take a job with a small First Nation, Hoopachesset, in their treaty negotiations in the early days of treaty. Was there for a number of years, and when they left the treaty process, moved on into some consulting work around policy and land use. Did a bunch of work in Forest Stewardship Council auditing, forestry certification, and then eventually wound up at West Coast Aquatic. But I think the common thread to all of the work in the past was about helping people have difficult conversations. So that was sort of what led me where we are today.
You know, I can appreciate there are a lot of difficult conversations at times in this field of work. How about you, Tim? What led you to West Coast Aquatic?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having us here as well. I also live here on Hoopachesset and Sechot territory in Port Alberni, and I'm pretty new here. So moved here in 2021. But I came to working here and living here. I started studying conservation biology at UBC in the Faculty of Forestry, pretty much out of spending a lot of time in nature, water, trees, lakes, paddling, that type of stuff. So got really interested in the conservation field broadly. And after a summer working for a First Nations owned forestry company, I realized I was more interested in the human and policy side of resource management than being in the field itself. So I eventually nagged a couple profs and talked them into letting me work for them over the summer as a research assistant, which turned into a master's degree, social study of science type field, where we were researching how people understand, use, and communicate genomic science in coho salmon management. In the process of doing that research, we were working with West Coast Aquatic here on West Coast Vancouver Island, talking to interviewees, having some focus groups. So that's where I first met Tawney and some of our other colleagues here. And after a couple years away doing some consulting work, I got in touch and they convinced me to move here and join the team. And it's been a really good ride. I guess another reflection on being a relative newcomer to this place in particular is that I feel like in this field, we often work with people who have really deep connections to place, whether they've been here for thousands of years and been fishing the same river, or their parents worked in the resource management field as scientists or in industry. And I kind of have a very different experience, a relative newcomer to Vancouver Island, and I spent most of my childhood in the United States. And I think it just ends up with a very different set of experience. I really value the deep connection that so many people have to place. And because of my history, it's different. So I take time here fishing and hiking and surfing and engaging with the water and the wildlife that are here. And I think that really builds connection and helps me relate to people. But fundamentally, as a newcomer, I'm not going to have that same place-based connection that so many people do. And so I think it's just something that I keep in mind as I relate to people, but it also sometimes is a little bit of a benefit to working in this position as a neutral facilitator. It enables me to be a little bit more positioned to be neutral in some cases, where other people might not be able to.
So congratulations, Tani, then on your recruitment efforts. You were obviously very persuasive and effective. And maybe
Yes.
you could tell us about West Coast Aquatic and its origin stories, because it wasn't immediately obvious to me when I was scouring the web and found a website that the organization was as deeply involved in co-management activities and stuff. So it'd be really great to capture that backstory for sure.
Absolutely. We've been formally incorporated as a not-for-profit since 2001, but the organization really stems several years, prior, and it's important to kind of understand what was happening here on WCVI at the time. And, back in 1993, there was the big conflict known as the War in the Woods. At the time, it was the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history. And it was a dispute over old growth logging in Clayoquot Sound. So there was that going on. And at the same time, there was early court cases on Indigenous rights starting to be reflected in management. And that led to some conflict between users. There was a lot of concerns by some people out here, as they named it, being a race-based fishery. Racism was quite strong, and there was a lot of conflict on the water. So around that time as well, coming out of the War in the Woods, there was a landmark decision with 5 of the Central Region First Nations in Clayoquot Sound, where they negotiated something known as the Central Region Board. And it was a very strong and early case of true co-management, where the 5 First Nations, the federal government, and the provincial government were co-managing the terrestrial resources in Clayoquot Sound. Layer on top of that, the Oceans Act that came in 1997, and there was strong language in that act around promoting integrated management, and something that they then called LOMAs, or large ocean management areas. And the west coast of Vancouver Island, down to the southern tip, was one of those large ocean management areas. So the combination of the Oceans Act, the door being kicked open into this realm of co-management with the Central Region. At the time, all of the New Chalmouth First Nations were collectively negotiating a treaty together. Many of them were. And West Coast Aquatic was formed as an interim measure to treaty to do co-management on that WCVI regional basis. It was a board that came together and really a bit of the brainchild of local people, folks like Cliff Atleo from Howsett First Nation, Dan Edwards, a commercial fisher, who, had been having conflict in the community, dissatisfaction with fisheries management. And as difficult as those conversations were, they said, yes, we're adversaries, but we're also neighbors. And we're always going to be neighbors. There's got to be a better way of doing business out here. And it was really that kind of vision, along with some of the legislation and the Central Region Board coming before it, that allowed this movement into doing ocean management on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So there was something then known as the Regional Aquatic Management Board, which was the precursor to West Coast Aquatic. And that was federal, provincial, regional government, along with the New Chalmouth governments. And then commercial, indigenous, and sport fishing, processing, environment, labor, marine transportation, forestry, tourism and recreation, bringing all of those groups together in one space to make consensus decisions about big picture issues that were affecting the livelihoods of those on the West Coast. So that was really our genesis. It's not necessarily what we are now. There's a lot of reasons for that. The appetite for co-management has shifted over time with government, but we've taken all of those same principles and values that were formed then to bring into our work to really focus on supporting collaboration in natural resource management. So that's a bit of our history.
And when you introduced yourself, you mentioned some of your early work was involved in treaty negotiations and they left the process. I'm just curious to learn more about what that situation might have looked like being involved directly in treaty negotiations, because not everyone gets the opportunity to participate in that and know what it looks like in practice. And super curious to learn what led to people leaving the process in the end.
Yeah, I think with the treaty, it's difficult. I mean, the west coast of Vancouver Island is very geographically diverse. The interests of each First Nation are also diverse, and it's hard to get everybody on the same page to want the same things at the same time. And ultimately, when the agreement in principle, which was stage 4, came to a vote, some communities just couldn't support it at the time. And the treaty vote failed. And some communities then regrouped together. They have successfully negotiated a treaty. They're known as the Mono First Nations. Other First Nations continued on in negotiations, and they're still in the process today. And other First Nations have left the treaty process completely. And I think that's probably the biggest thing when we look at where West Coast Aquatic is today compared to what was intended for it in the beginning, is that the political and legal, cultural and social environment over 20 plus years has really changed. I think 20 years ago, treaty was the only game in town. And now, through the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and the provincial act known as DRIPA and the federal action plan around that and the other evolving court cases, First Nations have a lot more choice in how they wish to engage with government, the Crown governments, and many more choices about how they find self-determination over their territory. And we see that real mix as it comes into the processes that we have the honor to facilitate.
Tim, for you coming into the organization now, relatively new, what have you been doing to sort of come to grips and with all of that history and whatnot? I know you're very inquisitive just from the few chats that we've had already, asking for papers and stuff like that. But have you been finding value learning about all that past context that Tawny's referring to there?
Absolutely. So, I mean, Tawney, Mark, others from West Coast Aquatic, but also that we work with as partners. Another good example is Les Sam from Sashot, who I work with at the Area 23 Roundtable. Learning from folks who have been involved in West Coast Aquatic's work for decades now really provides such a strong history to base our current work on. And I think a lot of the focus for me and for us now gets into this question of how do we support collaboration in natural resource management, specifically often to do with the aquatic and marine environment. How do we support that collaboration now, given the diversity of governance arrangements in First Nations, ways that First Nations relate to Crown governments, ways that people in general relate to each other here on West Coast of Vancouver Island and broadly on the Pacific Coast. And so I think a lot of what change looks like for us has been moving from a more formal co-management, co-governance context to a much more informal or grassroots form of supporting collaboration and supporting co-management. And that means that we have had to keep a core set of principles and really apply those in a fairly flexible way across a variety of different settings. And I find that, I mean, I'll often say one of the best parts of this job is just meeting such a huge diversity of people, engaging with a huge diversity of different topics and things that people care about, and just getting to constantly learn all the time, whether you're facilitating a meeting and there's presentations and you're just in lectures all day, and just by virtue of all the different types of people we get to work with, hear from, learn from. It's a wonderful setting to try and just sit, take it in, learn, and figure out what does that context mean for what we're doing now and how we can continue to do better and better at it.
I'm really interested to pick up on one of your points there about how things have evolved a little bit more informal now, because I know some people that critique co-management will say that you got to have a land claim, and this treaty gives co-management more legs and authority and so on. And I'm really interested to hear your perspectives on, do you agree with that, or do you feel doing it in the settings that you're in could potentially actually be more effective than having to have a treaty, so to speak?
I don't know that I would evaluate one over the other. I think there's a time and place for both, and it is just knowing that both are possible. There are groups in BC that have worked very hard and spent several years negotiating formal agreements and are now implementing those, and that's what's worked for them. Those agreements now here in BC, many of them either get rooted through treaty or through a process known as the Fisheries Resources Reconciliation Agreements. But 20 years ago, those tools didn't exist. And then it was a matter of people having some vision and commitment to do things in a different way. And I think we're very fortunate here on the West Coast that there were obviously community and Indigenous leaders and fishers who had that willingness to work in a different way. But there was also folks within government and DFO that, there wasn't necessarily the formal tool or perhaps even the permission sometimes, but they recognized that if communities can make those decisions themselves, they're going to be a lot more durable. All of the tables on the West Coast of Vancouver Island, they're voluntary. People are coming in, spending their own time, in cases their own money, and sitting down at these tables because they're finding value, and that's where that commitment comes from. I think in not having an agreement, sometimes the benefit really is the ability for flexibility. As conditions are changing, sometimes as people are changing, the ability to be nimble and have co-management be what it needs to be at that time and for that topic, there's that allowance. One of the concerns sometimes that we hear when there is a formal agreement is that people sometimes end up feeling the need to serve the agreement as opposed to having the agreement serve them. So maybe that's just one way of looking at it.
I like it. I guess all of my direct work has been in a case where there's a land claim agreement in place, and it certainly does influence and sometimes keep you within this box when the situation may dictate that you need to be doing something else.
Mhm.
And the land claim can sometimes be very, very strict. I guess, is there a particular project that you'd like to highlight as a success story that comes out of West Coast Aquatic and in that kind of environment where there isn't an agreement in place? Maybe there's more than one, but I'd love to hear some examples that we could highlight and what made it successful. I think it'd be really great to learn from those case studies.
Yeah, I've got a couple for you, and I know Tanya will have some as well. The first one that comes to mind is the Area 23 Harvest Committee, or Area 23 Roundtable. Sometimes it goes by both names. It's a process that is as old as our organization itself. So it's much older than my participation in it, but it is a voluntary roundtable that involves DFO, 3 different First Nations governments, so the Manolf Fisheries Commission, and then Hoopachesit and Sechot First Nations, and it involves their fishing departments, and it involves 2 commercial fishing organizations, the D Gill Netters Association and Area B Seine Association, who operate the commercial fishery in this sort of DFO statistical area of 23. And then the recreational fishery, typically represented through the Sports Fish Advisory Committee. There are also a few other representatives that sit on just as key community members. So those are the critical members of the roundtable. It's often also observed by fish processors, other folks from various governments, etc. And that table exists to coordinate and provide management input to DFO for the management of the what we call terminal salmon fisheries in Barkley Sound. Barkley Sound is where Port Alberni is, and Ucluelet and Bamfield are the 2 other major communities in Barkley Sound. And there's a really significant run of sockeye salmon and a really significant run of Chinook salmon. This table follows both of those seasons. So June through late July is sockeye season. Get a week or 2 of a break, and then we get into Chinook season, which starts up in August and goes through September. And in both of those seasons, there are really significant 3 different types of fisheries: Indigenous, commercial, and fish and sports fisheries, all going on at once. And in the early 2000s, lots of the people who've been involved in this since the beginning tell me that there were really significant conflicts, at times really quite scary conflicts between these various different fishing groups. There were gear conflicts, people running over each other's nets. There were just conflicts on the river, all these types of different things. And so people got together and said, hey, you're not going anywhere, I'm not going anywhere. We should figure out how we can have our fishery while you also have your fishery, and we're not caught up in fighting each other all the time. One of the first ways that started happening is coordinating effort. That might look like First Nations are setting gill nets in this area from these hours to these hours, and the commercial fishers are in this other area from these hours to these hours. And that kind of format has stayed till today. And so generally in these meetings, we talk as specific as who's setting what nets where, what are key times for sports fishers to pass through an area without worrying about running over gill netters, quite operational level management, as well as working with scientists to say, what is the run forecast? How many fish are we expecting to show up in the inlet this week? How many fish have we caught? There's an enormous amount of data that goes and analysis that goes into understanding how many fish are caught, who they're caught by, how many fish are what we call escaping or making it up into the river past critical fisheries to where they're able to either spawn naturally or return to a hatchery. And we keep track of all of those data as well as environmental data, water temperature, water flow rate in the rivers, stuff along those types of lines, to really make sure that the fishery is also managed sustainably. The groups all come together knowing that their future and being able to access these fish depends on a collective management of these fish sustainably. And so that's also looked like just really making sure at the beginning of the season, we set out, let's understand what we would like our fishery to look like and what some of the objectives are. Objectives could look like meeting our escapement targets. Sockeye salmon spawn in lakes here in this area. And so we say we would like to get this number of fish back to each of the key lakes that have these sockeye spawning populations. And we would like to, and another example of an objective is we would like to prioritize early spawners rather than late spawners. Early spawners migrate up the river when the river water is cold. They have better survival. They have better fitness or ability to spawn and be productive that way. So we've been over time concentrating effort on the later half of the run, effectively as a bit of a climate adaptation strategy. And that's a really challenging thing for fishers because early fish are also the brightest, they're the freshest. Our fish come back to Barkley Sound before they come back to Alaska or many other areas with big sockeye fisheries. So it involves some compromise in that fishers will actually hold off on fishing some of the most valuable fish to ensure that we can continue to protect that run in perpetuity. And so making all those types of decisions involves all those different fishing groups and governments coming to the table, consensus-based decision-making. And over time, I think it's really proven that this method and DFO working with this group for active in-season management and pre- and post-season management has led to being able to have pretty substantive fisheries here in a sustainable way ecologically and for the people who depend on accessing these fish for food or for profit.
I was going to ask, I think you just alluded to it, but I was curious to know if these roundtables made your decisions by consensus, and then how did they actually implement their consensus decisions? I guess is it voluntary implementation after that stage, or?
So to some extent, if you want to get into some of the mechanics of this, DFO still is the statutory decision maker responsible for managing fisheries. They're the ones who implement legally any sort of fishing regulation. And the C&P officers from DFO are the ones who go out and would be giving a fine to somebody who breaks those rules. That said, the process that's been really developed here is members from a certain group at the roundtable will propose something, let's say a geographical boundary. Let's say we're talking about the commercial gillnet fishery. We'll, for instance, propose this week we're going to be fishing from point A to point B in the inlet. And if all the members at the table agree that makes sense, it's going to protect this one run over here that we're a little bit worried about. It's going to give the fishers access to the number of fish that we think is appropriate for catching this week. Then DFO will actually take that advice that's consensus based and write that into this week's fishing bulletin. And then the C&P officers can go out and make sure that people are following those rules. Most of the time, that type of consensus-based process is exactly how the decisions are made on the fishery.
So, Tani, do you have a particular roundtable or case study you'd like to highlight? And I'm curious to get your insights as well in what you feel are some of the tricks or strategies to getting a solid consensus at some of these roundtables, because I know it takes time and it's hard work, and not everybody's committed to getting to consensus. It's not a normal way of doing business for a lot of people that are trained in Robert's Rules of Order and want expediency.
Yeah,
So I'm really curious to hear your
yeah.
case study example.
There's probably a number of them, but one that we've been recently involved in, and just in a facilitative role, so a fairly minor aspect, but the province of BC has two big strategies that they're working on right now, a coastal marine strategy and a watershed security strategy. And I think the success there is that those two strategies are being co-developed with First Nations. This was a commitment that the province of BC made, and then worked with First Nations to say, what does co-development look like? So this is a case where the government is really stepping out to try and do things in a new way. I think in your question, one of the things that's there really is, what are the conditions under which collaboration can happen and that consensus can take place? And I think consensus often, especially where things get really tricky, is that the trust has to be there. If I don't trust you, it's going to take a real leap for me to make a compromise. And trust, as you said, takes time. It takes the parties really knowing each other, and more sometimes than just in a professional role. At the Area 23 roundtable, these folks know family situations, other backgrounds, so they have that good sense of where people's values sit, what their motivations for being at the table are, where their limits are, where they're feeling pressured, perhaps, from their own communities. And doing that really just takes time, sometimes time that we don't have. And some of the ways that table has helped develop that is getting to know each other away from formal meetings, sharing a meal together, getting into the river together to haul a net on a beach thing, or coming in to do informal community visits. I think that becomes a critical aspect. And one of the big realizations I think that we had in this past year around getting to consensus, or whether processes were truly collaborative, was that just because something is multi-party, it's not necessarily collaborative. And some of the learnings that we've looked to are practitioner and author Adam Kahane. And he talks about this idea that collaboration is a choice. So if I can get what I want from you directly, I'm going to do that. That's the easiest path. That's one piece. So we have that opportunity to try and force an outcome. Or if I don't think that I can do that, perhaps my second choice is just to exit the situation. And that's something that we rarely ever see here, because people's livelihoods are tied up in this. That place to community that Tim talked about, they're not willing to exit the situation. So the third opportunity is to collaborate. If I can't get what I want, I may have to work with somebody else. Where we find some of the biggest challenges, I think, is where perhaps processes have been initiated through a government mandate and a group of people in the room and saying, you have to collaborate on this. Some people may not be willing to do that, or they may not be ready to do that. And in those cases, that's, I think, where we find the biggest challenge. So some of the biggest successes is where the willingness and want to collaborate really comes from the grassroots folks, not coming from above, from government.
One of the things that's been resonating with me all through our conversations is that each time you both speak, you're always talking about the plural and First Nations and many different nations. And in other places, there's not necessarily as much diversity. Like in our region of Canada, Labrador is a huge landmass, and there's three different Indigenous groups here, and sometimes they're not collaborating at all, and people sometimes get frustrated and wonder, like, why is that? Like, when you look at a place like BC where there's so many different First Nation groups, and kind of curious to know what that's like on the ground, and how do people come together and put all their different cultures and whatnot aside to collaborate. I think there's some great lessons there to share with other parts of Canada where there's a lot less players at the table in a lot of cases.
Yeah. I'll let Tim answer this, but just as the precursor, yes, there are groups in BC collaborating, but we have a similar situation to you as well. There are nations who are choosing to be working on their own through their own channels. Groups that collaborate on one topic may not collaborate on another, and groups that collaborated together in the past may not be now, and vice versa. So we do have that diversity of situation, I think, that you find as well. But Tim?
Yeah, I think bringing one's culture in its entirety and in how it informs you sometimes really enables you to collaborate. I think that's something that's been really taught to me. That's really valuable. And I do think that's something that from us as process people, you're looking to design a process, to support a process, facilitate a process that enables people to come to it with their whole selves, with their culture, with their personal background, with their educational background, whatever it looks like, and participate fully. Because without that full participation, you can get maybe an agreement on paper and it doesn't really translate to being able to operationalize that in reality. And so I do think that really becomes a key focus for us, is ensuring that in the processes we support, because there's this huge diversity of ways that First Nations relate to crown governments, relate to each other, relate to non-Indigenous people in this world that are engaged in the fishing industry or various other different aspects that we work with in these collaborative settings, that really people being able to come to this with their whole selves is critical to having lasting and meaningful collaborative success, if you can put it that way. I also think one of the interesting things that I'm in the process of learning as a practitioner that could be possibly helpful is that I'm learning to be okay with working on a collaborative process and investing heavily in it and letting it go when people don't want to see it through to completion. This is really challenging, because I think in order to do this type of work, you have to care about the things you're working on. You have to care about the people that you're working with. You have to put some hope into the process that what we're working on together is going to be better than what exists now. And so when people walk away from that for whatever reason, because it's not right for them, because the pressure that's on them as a representative for their community is such that they just have to walk away from this collaborative process and things fall apart, I'm learning to really figure out how to let that go and to move on and to regroup and to refocus yourself in a different way. Tawny's told me before, you have to make sure that you are coming into this as a practitioner supporting that collaboration. You can't care about it more than the people who this is for. You can care about it a lot, but that it is okay to support things and have that be organic in terms of what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, let me try to pose this question to you both, see if I can articulate it right. And you'll both give me your most diplomatic answers and whatnot. Because one of the parties that often comes to these tables, and they have their own culture that they have to work within as well, is the bureaucracy, whether it's the government of Canada or the provincial government. And I'm curious from your perspective, as you said, like as process people, is there advice that you would give to someone from one of the governments when they come to present themselves in their roles and how they could do it in a good way and be most productive and help facilitate a consensus? I'm trying to get practical ideas for people in government that could sort of ponder this and see how they show up in the future in meetings. Sure, thoughts on that?
I think one of the approaches that it's, no different in one of these processes than how you approach building a relationship with anyone in any situation. And as Tim said, bringing his own interests and values in and really hearing those from others would be the same for government. It's that sort of authenticity that you bring to the table. I think there's a sense of vulnerability as well. If anybody comes into a process and they read their mandate out of the book, people see through that and it doesn't hold up very long. But sometimes people will come down on government and the DFO did this. And we always try to remind them that yes, the department is a thing, but it's also, and it has its rules and its regulations that have to be followed, but it's also a collection of people. And what we often see is that those people that are on the other side of the table that you're hoping to be able to work shoulder to shoulder with do have a deep caring for the resource. They want to understand more about the values and interests that people are bringing to the table. And they're individuals and they're human beings. They're mothers and fathers and wives and husbands. And if we're able to treat each other like that at the table and have that respect for each other as individuals and see each other in that light, that really opens up the way that we're able to communicate with each other, as opposed to I'm the government and I have to represent that singular stance, or the same with sectors or First Nations. Meeting people where they're at, showing who you are, demonstrating that you have that care for the resource. We had a table that had some difficulties and it really was a feeling of us versus them. And we did a bit of an exercise, and where it came out at the end was people realizing that every single person in that room was really there for the same reason. They cared about the fish and they wanted that fishing culture to be alive and well for their children and grandchildren. So if we can find those aspects and bring ourselves into a process that way, whether we're government or otherwise, I think that's a good start.
It's making me think too about, I'm sure you've been in meetings like this where people show up with their PowerPoints and they're highly technical, a lot of graphs, very hard to understand for even people that are trained as quantitative scientists, for argument's sake. And I'm just wondering, do you have approaches on how you get people to share information in different ways that are not going to shut people down? Because that's kind of what I feel I witness is when the graphs go up, people's eyes gloss over and there's no dialogue happening. And how do we, or how do you, I guess, change up the format so people in government still get to share what they need to share, but just in a way that it's being received?
You preempted me here. I was going to transition us to talking about language, but yes, no, thank you. I think that's a really key component. Might talk a little bit generally and then get into an example of a challenging project for us to do with salmon population rebuilding and how that dynamic kind of plays out. But yeah, absolutely. I would say there are a lot of different ways of how people use language to communicate ideas. Some of the key ones that I'm sure you're familiar with, and many people in this field are, that scientific language is it's a particular language. Process or planning language is a particular language. You can combine that with almost sort of policy or sometimes even legal language. There are distinct ways that Indigenous peoples communicate information. And there are just distinct ways that people who often work in a more operational resource industry capacity communicate information and think about the world. And so I would maybe advice, or it's something that I'm working on, is learning how to build as much familiarity as you can with the various different languages, if you can call it that, that people use to communicate information. And you're never going to be fluent in something that's not your own. I totally have a science bias. It's always going to be that way because it's my educational background. It's a way that I communicate with family members who are also scientists, etc. But I think that there is a huge benefit, and it would be something that I'd offer as advice, in learning how to communicate with others in those different languages, and also sort of understand where and when and how to use those various different ways of communicating. And I think one of the biggest risks in our field is that people will jump to that planning language or policy language as almost a common ground. And I think it can be as inaccessible for people as scientific language can be. And so being very conscious about how you communicate those ideas is really critical. You'd asked us in preparation to kind of prepare some examples of challenging projects. And one that's been really challenging for a distinct set of reasons is we've been working the last few years on a West Coast of Vancouver Island Chinook salmon rebuilding plan. I mentioned that we have a robust Chinook fishery here in Barkley Sound, but across much of West Coast of Vancouver Island, the Chinook salmon are really struggling. And so there are some legal obligations that DFO has to develop a rebuilding plan under the Fisheries Act for these fish. And it's been a longstanding First Nations community priority to rebuild some of these populations. It's just something that's of interest to everybody here. And so starting in maybe 2020, they're building on a lot of work that kind of came before then, all entered into this formal rebuilding planning process. And we're still in it. It's not done. It's nowhere close to being done in many senses in terms of tangible action and rebuilt populations. But I think what's fundamentally challenging about doing this is that it's new. We're really used to, or various different people in our field are really used to doing research, learning more about something. That's comfortable. We're used to advocacy. That's comfortable. We're used to taking tangible action on something that we can control. That's comfortable in many ways. But working together on a really large scale and a diverse scale to translate knowledge in its variety of forms into action that rebuilds tangibly a salmon stock is really challenging. A bunch of also challenges that come to that are that salmon don't act like a lot of other fish. They have an anadromous life history cycle that really puts them at a place that they're vulnerable to everything from land use changes on land that impact their river habitats or lake habitats to large-scale temperature and salinity and pH changes in the ocean to all the different ways that we impact their habitat in between. And I think we've really been, I think scale is a big issue of how do you coordinate such a huge diversity of people across a big scale of where these fish live throughout their life history. Our West Coast Vancouver Island Chinook are born and die here on West Coast Vancouver Island, but they swim up during their lives up into Alaska. And they come all the way back down the coast. And coordinating across that scale has been really challenging. One, Government of Canada, First Nations governments, Government of Alaska. One government can't do everything that needs to be done to rebuild these populations. So it requires collaboration. Salmon, especially on the freshwater side. Habitat sometimes falls in a crack between provincial and federal jurisdiction, where provincial jurisdiction has to do with forest management and the protection of riparian areas that really protect river habitat for Chinook, but salmon are federal jurisdiction. So sometimes salmon fall through that crack and don't get protected in a way that they otherwise should be. And then I think there's just a fundamental question of how do you do something new and engage in using scientific knowledge, acknowledging uncertainty. That it's a big part of this is that we could continue to research this for as long as we all live and our kids live, and there will still be questions. And those are important questions to answer and try and better understand. But how do we take action on limited information and translate that into tangible, meaningful actions? And so I just think basically we've learned that engaging in that process, it's new, it's uncomfortable for people in many ways. It's challenging because we don't have models to follow, and it's really slow because you'll do something and then maybe that's not quite right. Maybe that process didn't work. We weren't able to have the conversations we need to have. There's some research gaps that are missing. There's some all sorts of different challenges. And so aligning timelines, working together on a novel process to do rebuilding is just challenging. But I think I'm really hopeful that we can learn a lot from this process on West Coast Vancouver Island, translate it into a lot of the other rebuilding planning efforts that are ongoing across the Pacific Coast, sort of build a bit of a practice of how do you translate knowledge into some really tangible results, not just in terms of people working together, but too in terms of measurable rebuilt salmon populations where that's possible.
Just upon reflection on our conversation, there's a lot of good things happening. There's some challenging tables, and it's always going to be very dynamic. And I guess we're 30 years now since the war in the woods, and a lot of dialogue over that period of time. I'd be curious on what your thoughts are about the state of co-management, I guess, at this time in your area. Do you think it's in a good place? Is it clearly seems to have progressed, but I'm curious how you feel about the future and the current state of co-management.
I feel good about the current state. Certainly, it seems to have, had gone through some trends, both up and down, but more and more, and it was our goal, because for a long time, people talked about the West Coast Vancouver Island roundtables as a pilot project through the wild salmon policy. And we had said some time back, we'd really love to see it be the norm and not an exception, not a pilot. And it was deeply frustrating and I think saddening for many folks when the Regional Aquatic Management Board, then the West Coast Aquatic Governance Board, kind of petered out because we had certain governments not participating, or then we had shifts in the interests of First Nations. As Tim said, sometimes you need to let a bit of that go. But I think part of the other reason that, it failed was because we didn't have this broader environment that was supporting it. You get very supportive people and perhaps they move on or retire. I think where we're at today, though, is that we have a lot more tools available to us, that there are mandates coming from the Crown government around co-development and co-management with First Nations and Indigenous people and others. But people also eventually start to see some of these good examples around them. I remember going to a fishing association meeting, sharing what was happening here in Area 23 with all these fishing groups coming together and developing localized management plans. And one of the fishers stood up and said, "Huh? You got to be kidding, that's going on." I had no idea, and B, how come we're not doing that elsewhere? I think as people find successes, sometimes small, sometimes big, people start to hear about that. It helps spark the imagination of what's possible. Back that up again with a bunch of tools that we have now, a number of court cases, government mandates and policies, different agreement types that are coming out. Co-management isn't one thing, and it can look very different to different groups in different situations. And I think we've got a lot of the tools now that allow people to participate in those different ways that perhaps wasn't possible even 5 years ago.
I would say, and maybe it's a bit of a bias because I'm young, but I am encouraged by a lot of the other young professionals in the field who've grown up in this field, or their whole career has been in a time where co-management is becoming in many settings a norm. And so as much as we've emphasized that co-management is fundamentally a very personal thing, much more than it is a formal thing, I think, especially in our area, I really think that having a lot of people that are my age or a bit older or a bit younger who are growing up with or building their careers in a setting where this is the norm and learning how to do it, practicing it in and out, I really think that is a really encouraging, just personal basis for people to have. And I think that there are a lot of people in our field working for First Nations, working for governments, working for nonprofits, working for industry, who really understand and are being immersed and really can't see any other way of doing it right now.
Yeah. As much as anything, sometimes co-management isn't a process, it's an attitude. And more seeing people really believe in it, and the merits in doing business in a different way.
Nice. And it was interesting in a recent podcast with Dr. Fikret Berkes. I know in the end of his, he certainly found a lot of hope in thinking about some of his younger students. And to your point, they've only ever seen these different times now where things are a bit more progressive than in the earlier years when people were really fighting without all those tools that you talked about in today. And I find your conversation and the stories you're sharing very motivating to know that there are more tools out there today. There is a good state of co-management in your area, and there is that diversity. And I just wonder if there was one thing that you wanted to make sure that got shared from our conversation. Is there anything else that you think people should know or think about if they're involved in co-management or about to dip their toes in?
I think for the people who are about to dip their toes, some of them may have never worked together before, some of them may have, but we've often kind of reflected that you just need to start where you can. Sometimes we may be faced with a huge consequential kind of issue with people who are still in an adversarial relationship, have never worked together before. That might not be the place to start. But in those cases where we've had a bit of luxury and the liberty of time, where do they still really see eye to eye? Where do they share a common outcome? Sometimes and often that is in the area of restoration, because that's again coming back to the fish and less consequent or less controversial than, for example, harvest or management decisions. So it's okay to start small. And I think that there's always a good relationship somewhere that could be built on. So it's finding some of those little nuggets. If we look at the big issues where there's a lot of contention, it can feel really daunting. And sometimes people just don't even feel like they can try. But if we can find those smaller areas to start and build on that momentum, starting small is a good thing.
Maybe a bit of, I was trying to think of some advice for people who are in university right now and really interested in co-management as a space. And I think something that's really changed, even in the, I don't know how long it's been, not that many years since I was in undergrad, is I think when I was in school, it was co-management or collaborative planning kind of was a field. And if you were really interested in that, you figure out, okay, how can I sort of pursue this? And then it's really unclear what you do for work, but it was niche in some ways. And the more I'm involved in this, you can obviously still try and become a facilitator and work as or as a planner or something like that. But I think about friends of mine who are biologists working for government or working for a First Nation or something, friends of mine who are working as foresters. Everybody, especially in BC nowadays, has some component of co-management, I really think, in what they do for work. And I think as much as you can learn from a variety of situations. I guess this would be my advice to students, is as much as you can learn about co-management and how this happens, that's something that I think you can really bring into whatever career path you're in. You can be a biologist who supports co-management. You can be a forester who supports co-management. You can be a facilitator who supports co-management, and that actually having a diversity of that type of experience is really useful for these types of settings. And I think it's really powerful to have people who have that sort of scientific or management expertise who are also really familiar with things like consensus building, the various sort of legal aspects of Indigenous rights, that those can really be assets, even if you are an expert sort of in say a biologist role in this type of field. So
Yeah, I like that you alluded to the ambiguity of what these positions are, because I sometimes get texts from family and asking me to remind them what it is I do again, because they're
We
not
get
quite
that too.
sure. Yeah, if you're not, my dad's a lab and x-ray technician, and my brother's a paramedic, all these other fields where people can picture it very clearly. But I guess to sort of wrap up our conversation a little bit, I'm really curious to unpack something you said there a moment ago, Tani, about co-management as an attitude. I never heard that turn or phrase before, and I'd be curious for you to share more what you mean by that. Co-management is more of an attitude.
Well, I think it again comes back to that, piece of it being a choice. You've got to believe that there's merits to it, that it can lead to a better situation and a better decision and outcome by working with others. It's about coming in really valuing that another person's fishery or place on the land is legitimate, that I believe in a diversity of opinions being a good thing, that I believe that multiple knowledge systems, Western science or Indigenous knowledge coming together, is beneficial to what we're all trying to build. If I come in with the attitude that I'm here because I have to be, somebody has forced me to, and that I'm still just here to get what I want out of this, that's going to put that process in a very difficult place.
That's a really great way to sum up. I really like that turn of phrase, and your explanation of it is very helpful. So thank you both for taking an hour or more now out of your morning. And I hope we can stay in touch. And I'd like to invite you both to reach out to me anytime if you'd like to come back and do another conversation. Maybe it's about like a specific activity or time of year or new initiative. We can be very specific. I think there's clearly a lot to learn from the work that you're doing there. So I really appreciate you both.
Thanks. We enjoyed the conversation and really appreciate the invite.
All right, you take care. Hi, I'm Dr. Jamie Snook, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Co-Management Commons Show. Honoring the spirit and intent of agreements with Indigenous peoples is an important form of reconciliation and social justice, and educating ourselves about opportunities with co-management is time well spent. This conversation continues, so please like, share, subscribe, and visit www.comanagement.ca. Join me again next time for another interesting discussion about the co-management of fish and wildlife in Canada and around the world.